good morning, or possibly even afternoon to our attendees based not in the UK. I'd like to welcome you to our first online workshop. This workshop is titled Compliance Beyond Brexit. This would have been run in person, but due to current situations, we've moved it online because we still think this is a relevant topic and something people will be interested in. Just a quick introduction to myself. My name is Richard Biggs and I'll be the host for today's event. But back to the topic at hand, when we kind of talk around Brexit, there's still a lot of uncertainty, especially around the current situation we all find ourselves in. What we tend to find is, although there are a lot of unanswered questions, there's also a lot of misinformation that seems to be flying around the internet in terms of Brexit and what's going on. And we're hopeful that during this workshop, you'll find some insight into where we actually currently stand and also what we can do to move forwards. Today's presenters are Di Davis, who is a partner at Percy Crowe Davis & Co. John Lee, who is a certification manager at Tufsud, and Rob Campling, who is a business line manager for IoT and global market access at Tufsud. Quick look at the agenda in terms of what we're presenting today. Then first will be Di with Brexit and CE marking. Then we will be looking at beyond Brexit and placing products on the EU and UK markets. And then finally, global market access with Rob. And then that'll be followed by the panel discussion. So our first speaker is Di Davis. So Di, if I could hand over to you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And as was suggested by Richard, good afternoon as well to those of you who are not in the UK, if you are abroad. I will be talking about CE marking, and I'm going to start by talking about the structure of CE marking, just to remind you about the international connotations of the CE marking and how it interacts with foreign law, or European law, I should say, and the interaction between UK and European law. I'm going to talk a little bit about the existing divergence of European and UK law, and then talk about what we know already about what is going to happen when the United Kingdom leaves the European Union, and then I'll be saying something about withdrawal agreement itself, and then more about divergence till I run out of time. So, without further ado, let me start by talking a little bit about reminding ourselves about the structure of the CE marking legislation. And it comes from Treaty of Rome, and it was part, or the CE marking for the most part, is part of what was called the 1992 process, which, being the European Union, and being the European Union never gets anything done on time, started on the 1st of January 1993. And was this, in English, the freedom of movement of goods. The idea being that if you are having a freedom of movement of goods, then you can't have a different safety standard in one country from another. And previously, Germany, for example, had, relatively speaking, higher safety standards than many of the other European countries and would stop goods being imported into Germany. The idea behind the CE marking legislation is that there is one safety-related standard, which if you pass that standard, your goods are then free to move throughout the European Union. The so-called at the time new approach directives. I used to get a lot of stick about emphasising that this was safety-related legislation, which it is. I remember a few sessions back in the early 1990s when I was speaking, and used to get heckled quite regularly by people who said that this wasn't safety-related legislation. It's all safety-related legislation, including the EMC legislation. The reason being that the European community has rules, internal governance rules, and the hook, if you like, on which the legislation is hung on is I should say, grounds of safety. So the legislation is there primarily to stop, to have a uniform safety culture, if you like, throughout the whole of Europe, and in particular to stop other countries, which they otherwise could, preventing imports of goods into their country because of the fact that they have a higher safety standard. Of course, with the United Kingdom leaving the European Union, we will be free, in theory at least, to have a different safety standard, and the same the rest of the European Union. But we'll talk about quite how far the divergence of safety standards might actually go in the course of the next 15 minutes or so. The structure of the legislation is that by and large, and I say by and large because the CE marking legislation is not uniform throughout the terminology it uses in all of the directives. But essentially, the most important thing to appreciate is that there are, if you like, two hurdles that you have to jump over, and people often forget the second of those two hurdles. The first is often called conformance assessment, which relates to ensuring that the goods meet appropriate, where they exist, European standards, and if not, a technical file is built and it passes the rigors, the internal rigors of the testing regime established by that particular directive, CE marking directive, but also the essential requirements. What I mean by the essential requirements are the inbuilt standards, or if you like, safety statements that are made within the directive itself. So for example, Machine Safety Directive has an annex at the back, which is, if you like, also has to be met, as well as whatever testing regime you have to follow for that particular machine. So there is invariably, if you like, a twofold hurdle, one relating to external testing and or standards, and the other relating to whatever the directive itself states about safety or obligations that are inbuilt into the directive. Many, as you know, of the CE marking directives are self-certifying, some are not. In virtually all cases, you have to have a declaration of compliance that you have actually gone through the structure of the relevant CE marking directive. And another important attribute of the directives is that, for the most part, again, there are small exceptions, but for the most part, the legislation is cumulative. You can classify the CE marking directive legislation in lots of different ways, but this screen will shows you the primary legislation on the left and the less common legislation on the right. Of course, if you're a manufacturer of toys and I'm talking to you, then you're going to say, no, the toy safety one's the most important one to me because that's all I do. That I understand, but by and large, the ones on the left are the ones that are more generic, if you like, than the ones on the right. But the legislation is all cumulative. So if, for example, you're making a radio-controlled kids' yacht toy that goes on a lake, then you're going to have almost certainly, you're going to have a toy safety legislation, you're going to have EMC legislation, and depending upon your view, you're going to have either machine safety or low voltage. And machine safety and low voltage being one of the examples of legislation where there's a little bit of exclusion, one or the other. But the most important principle behind it is that, in general, you cumulate the relevant CE marking legislation that you have to follow. I mentioned when I was looking at, when I was explaining the structure, and that the most important or the specific generic attitude is that you have to have what's called performance assessment, which is to do with usually standards, that this legislation is based upon standards. And indeed, if there are published European harmonized standards, then those are the standards that you have to follow. Either the ones produced by CEN for non-electronic products, CENELEC electronic products, and ETSI being the European standards body for telecommunications. When the legislation was being put forward by the European Union in the late 1980s, the European Union engaged, I think it was KPMG, to do a study of how many standards were required in order for the CE marking legislation to operate correctly. The answer that they came back with in the late 1980s in their report was 250,000, 250,000 standards were required in order to make this legislation work. How many standards have we got? Ooh, well, probably about order of magnitude 7,500, although half of those will be dangerously out of date. We have completely failed in terms of the number of standards required. And of course, if you did that study today, you wouldn't end up with 250,000 standards. You'd end up with probably 10 times that number. If you think of the number of electronic products alone that are on the market today, which weren't even thought about in the 1980s, late 1980s, a huge number of standards which we don't have. So in theory, you follow European harmonized standards. Of course, there are high-level standards, but the original intention was to be high-level standards, then medium-level standards, and then product-specific standards. We haven't got anywhere near most of those product-specific standards, and probably never will. So where there are harmonized standards, you can follow them. And then if you, as an alternative, if you don't, then, for example, in machine safety, you have a type examination, you produce a technical file to essentially test the product through your own, I wouldn't say your own standard, but your own rigors of testing, which I'm sure John and Rob will mention when they're talking about CE marking in more detail from a practical perspective. Of course, the first thing to say is that CEN, European norm, the EN being standing for European norm, and CENELEC are European bodies, ETSI, a European body. These are bodies established through the auspices of the European Union. So when we leave the European Union, assuming we do on the 31st of December this year, end of this year, or any other date, then we will no longer be voting members of CEN, CENELEC, or ETSI. However, in practice, the CEN, CENELEC, and ETSI are nothing like as powerful as you might imagine them to be. Because in reality, many of the standards they adopt are ones that are developed by international standards at ISA, International Electrotechnical Commission, and ITU. In other words, many of the European standards are very much dependent on the earlier development of international standards and merely follow those international standards. That's not entirely true, but it is primarily true that CEN, CENELEC, and ETSI are subsidiary organizations in many respects to ISA, IEC, and ITU. And the United Kingdom is, and for a long time has been, primary movers, particularly in ISA and the IEC. So although the United Kingdom will lose its voting rights to CEN, CENELEC, and ETSI, it will still influence standards to a very large degree, even post-Brexit, because the United Kingdom government has historically and still does give money to the British Standards Institute and allows the British Standards Institute to, how shall I say, punch beyond its weight, I think is the expression that one might use. Well, let me move on to the withdrawal agreement. And the first thing, I don't know why it says intellectual property. Well, I do know why it says intellectual property at the top there. It's because I was doing a talk about Brexit and intellectual property yesterday, so apologies about that. I should say, what does the withdrawal agreement say about CE marking? The answer is exactly the same. The first thing to say about the withdrawal agreement is it's a misnomer. It's not actually an agreement. It is an agreement to agree. The reality is that the European community couldn't agree what the leaving regime was going to be for the United Kingdom, so essentially kicked the can down the road. The reason we had the issue about the Irish border, if you recall, the sticking point of the withdrawal agreement was, well, what happens if we don't reach an agreement? What's going to happen to the Irish border? It was what happens if we don't reach an agreement. The point being that the withdrawal agreement, essentially, all it does is carry on the existing, the pre-Brexit regime for the current transition period, being these 11 months that we're now in the middle of, by which when we left on the 31st of January, we're supposed to be leaving. So we're supposed to be, the withdrawal agreement is supposed to terminate on the 31st of December. So we're in the middle of this 11-month transition period, and essentially all the withdrawal agreement does is carry on the previous regime for this interim period, but it doesn't really say anything at all about what happens at the end of that period. So at the moment, we're still up for grabs as to what actually will happen on the 31st of December. However, there are other statements that you can make. So for example, why have I made the statement most European law is now irrelevant? Well, the first thing to say is, how much law do we have which is European? And of course, all the CE marking legislation is European. What does C, by the way, stand for? Well, officially, the letters C don't stand for anything, officially. If you ask a French person what they stand for, they will say Conformance Européen. But officially, the letters C don't stand for anything. All of the CE marking legislation is European, and about 60% of the law in the United Kingdom stems from European law. Who is the ultimate arbiter of that European law? At the moment, it carries on as it was prior to the transition period. The ultimate arbiter is the European Court of Justice. Picture of European Court of Justice on the right of my screen here. So the European Court of Justice is the ultimate arbiter, and the European Court of Justice essentially consists of a judge from each of the member states, each of the now 28 member states. So each member state has a judge, and they all sit together in the European Court of Justice. There are very, very few cases that are heard by all 28 judges. Most of them are heard by panels of judges, but some cases, important cases, do end up being held by the full court. How many languages do we have in the European Union? My style, my normal lecturing style, is highly interactive, and at this point in time, I'll probably offer a prize for the person who guessed this correctly. I can tell you there's less than 28. We have 28 countries if you include the UK still. Of course, the UK is no longer in the European Union, but 27 plus the United Kingdom, we have less than 28 languages. For example, the English and the Irish sharing English language. The French, sorry, that's going to say the Belgians have two official languages in their country, Flemish and French, but the legislation is only in French. I'm not going to have an interactive style for this. Unfortunately, can't do it for this Zoom meeting. But in reality, we have 22 official languages, not just French and German, but there are 22 official languages. And each of those languages has the same precedence. There's no single language that has precedence over another. It probably won't surprise you if I tell you that not all the translations are identical. I, as a lawyer, I wouldn't say regularly, but every couple of years, if I've had an issue, most recently on the GDPR, the General Data Protection legislation, which you've heard of, there were ambiguities in that legislation when I was trying to understand what it said. There were a couple of areas where I looked at the French and the Italian version to try and disambiguate the issue that I was looking at. It's exactly the same under the CE marking legislation. I've had situations where I haven't been able to follow the legislation precisely, or said, well, that's ambiguous. And then I've looked at a foreign language version to try and disambiguate the point. So probably won't surprise you if I tell you that the translations are not exact. They're not exact. One of the surprising features of where they're not exact, however, is ands and ors. The problem being that people who translate the legislation, particularly in the area of CE marking, don't by and large understand what they're translating. So you can find examples even in the C marking legislation where one language version says if A and B and C, and the other language version says if A or B or C. Clearly in those situations you have an ambiguity that you have to try and resolve by looking at different languages. Please don't ask me what happens if we have 11 versions of each ambiguity. I've never come across a situation anything like that. So if you think about the fact that at the moment each of those language versions have priority, we have lost over 95% of our law already. Why have we lost over 95% of our law already? Well, the answer is, of course, because if you go before an English judge, which post 31st December you will, an English judge is not going to take the slightest bit of notice of the French version or the German version. The English judge is only going to take notice of the English version of the directive or the underlying legislation, and trying to persuade an English judge post 31st of December to take notice of a foreign language version is going to be virtually impossible. So that's one of the reasons we've already lost legislation. I'm just keeping one eye on time here, and appreciating that I haven't got that much time left, but I'll try and finish in the next 2 or 3 minutes. I talked about the C marking legislation essentially being harmonised legislation. The whole purpose is having a same legislation throughout the whole of Europe, so that one country doesn't have an arbitrary border vis-a-vis the other. One of the areas, and the most important area that isn't harmonised, is the enforcement legislation. And again, I'm not going to dwell on this point, because it's not the subject matter of this lecture, but to remind you that one of the primary ways that this legislation works is by always having someone within the European Union to, if you like, latch onto if the C marking legislation has not been complied with, the so-called authorised representative. If you have a European Union manufacturer, then the authorised, essentially the person who is responsible is the manufacturer. If you don't have a manufacturer, but you have an importer, then if their manufacturer, if a foreign manufacturer fails to have an authorised representative within the European Union, then the importer becomes essentially the person responsible, the authorised representative. So there'll always be either the manufacturer's authorised representative, or an importer who within the European Union authorities can latch onto if the C marking has been wrongly affixed, or if the product is not actually compliant with the relevant C marking legislation. Of course, when the United Kingdom leaves the European Union, one can automatically say that unless we have a transition, a further arrangement respecting one another's, by which I mean the European Union and the UK have a recognition of each other's CE marking regimes, which personally I think is politically unlikely, but possible. If that doesn't happen, then the automatic criteria that will happen post-Europe, post 31st of December 2000, I should say, within Europe, is that you'll have a UK regime where you have to have, if you don't have a UK manufacturer of the relevant goods, an authorised representative in the UK. And if you don't have an authorised representative in the UK, then the importer in the UK will be responsible for the UK equivalent of the CE marking regime post 2020. And in the rest of Europe, the other remaining 27 countries, you will have a CE marking regime that carries on as it is at the moment, but the authorised representative, if, for example, the manufacturer is in the UK or in the US, outside the EU, which will include the UK for those purposes, then the authorised representative will be the person authorised within the remaining 27 countries, and if there isn't one, then the importer into those remaining 27 countries. So you'll end up essentially with two parallel CE marking type regimes. I'm going to finish in 30 seconds, but the only other thing that I wanted to mention is that not all of the European enforcement is the same as in the UK, which is criminal enforcement. You'll know that we have criminal enforcement in the UK. But for example, if you look at Norway and Sweden, the primary enforcement methods in Norway and Sweden are not criminal. They're actually compulsory product recall, which can then lead, if you don't have the product recall, to fine and imprisonment. So it's important to appreciate that we don't all follow the criminal first attitude to prosecuting the legislation. Well, that's all I have time to say formally at the moment, and I'll be pleased to answer questions later. And hand back now to you, please, Richard.
Thank you, Di. Thank you for that information. Now I'd just like to hand over to John Lee, who's going to do our next presentation.
Good morning, everybody. My name is John Lee, and I'm the Certification Manager for TÜV SÜD UK. Whilst I would like to be able to present exactly what is required with respect to placing products on the UK market in this presentation, and after the transition period, you'll see that in the following slides there's quite a lot of uncertainty as to what may happen next. However, hopefully this will provide some of the background where things are going, and hopefully I'll do a slightly better job than our recent lockdown speech from the UK government. So just as some history, the European Union Withdrawal Act gained parliamentary approval in December, and this was accelerated through just because we had a new government in the UK. So it entered into force on the 31st of January. And as everybody knows, we're now in this transition period, or longer in the event of an extension, and I'll cover that in the next slide. So there is a possibility that we could extend this period. And just to make it very clear, during this transition period, CE marking only applies for placing products on the UK market, and then after which is trade agreement required. We can't do UKCA marking. It doesn't legally exist at the moment. So just putting that into a timeline, we have the Brexit day, the start of the transition period. The trade talks have begun, but we're hurtling towards a deadline because the deadline for the transition extension is actually the end of June. So, and I think this is looking quite likely now just because of the current lockdown situation and COVID-19 and the pandemic that's going around the world. And then finally, towards the end, the transition period ends, and then the 1st of January, we're then into having a new trade deal or an MRA or both or nothing, and we fall off a cliff. And so the trade deal negotiations have actually started. One thing that just to highlight straight away, that the EU and UK governments have both put out statements in February about what they want to happen next. So these are quite important documents. So this goes along with the withdrawal agreement that Di Davies talked about. On top of that, the withdrawal agreement is like a framework to start with, and then they've also put out, this is what we want to happen next. So the EU put out a statement on the 25th of February. It's got wording in there that about concerns about TBTs, and TBTs are technical barriers to trade. So it's concerns over potentially putting in more barriers, and it's talking about sharing current practices and sharing international standards, for example. So it's more of a approach towards an MRA, I'd say again. And then also 2 days after that, Michael Gove released what the UK wants next document on the 27th of February, and this is a future relationship document. Interestingly enough, in that particular document, it talks about mutual recognition of conformity assessments. So that's kind of flying in the face of what's been discussed about UKCA potentially being required, and more towards an MRA. which we have with other countries. And it also talks about mutual recognition of certificates of conformity specifically for the marine equipment, which is, again, slightly contradictory of what we've been hearing about the UKCA mark and the statutory instruments. And of course, both of these documents have differing views, as you'd expect. So why a lot of people are probably on this call is about this. How likely is UK Conformity Assessment Mark required at the end of this year? And it is definitely possible because we have an amending statutory instrument that went through. But again, we need to be very clear, there's nothing set yet. So just a bit of a background information about statutory instruments, or SIs. So SIs are where the UK has taken a European directive and adopted this into UK legislation. So this is making it into UK law. So for example, the Radio Equipment Directive was implemented into UK law under this statutory instrument. So in 2017, it's number 1206. And you can look at all these legislation documents on legislation.gov.uk website. You can search for everything and everything's there. So when the original Brexit happened, during the original possibility that we were hurtling towards a no-deal Brexit, the statutory instrument, there was a statutory instrument put out about specifically across multiple statutory instruments, amending it. So it's a Brexit statutory instrument. So this was in 2019. It's the UK Product Safety and Metrology EU Exit Regulation, rolls off the tongue. And it actually amends multiple other statutory instruments, including, for example, the radio equipment statutory instruments. In this, there's 29 statutory instruments that are amended in this document. So it changes the wording, and this is where the UKCA marking requirements have come from fundamentally. So I've mentioned the Radio Equipment Directive. It covers this one particularly covers nearly all of the directives we're used to from a European perspective. So the EMC Directive, the Low Voltage Directive, Machinery Directive, and everything else is all covered by this amending statutory instrument, this legislation. One point to note, it does come into force on exit day. So theoretically, this just goes straight in. So based on that no-deal statutory instrument, which is still in place, some of the terminology that you may have to get used to if UKCA marking is required is on this slide here. So for CE marking, it becomes UK marking, and then we talk about this UKCA mark, UK Conformity Assessment Mark. EU notified bodies that we're all used to, from notified bodies that for certification of machinery and everything else, they become UK approved bodies, and they're approved by the UK Secretary of State. Some of the amendments use slightly different wordings. They use a UK designated body and not a UK approved body. And then EC Europa NANDO notified body list, again, what we're used to. So if you're looking for a particular notified body for your particular needs in a certain country, for example, you would go to this NANDO list. There would then be an additional list for UK-based approved bodies. Harmonised standards are then known as designated standards for the UK, and they're designated by the UK Secretary of State again. An official journal cited harmonised standards become UK designated standard list. So we would have in the UK potentially a separate designated standard list. And we still need a declaration of conformity, but it's obviously a UK declaration of conformity, and it would be based on, for example, the statutory instruments. So one rumour that was going around that people may have heard about, that as well as UKCA marking, UK Northern Ireland mark. And no, this isn't a joke. How likely is this? It is possible. The main reason being is because Northern Ireland has a unique position in the Withdrawal Agreement. As we all know, it has unique now trading rules and unique separation from the UK effectively. So one particular document that I'd like to highlight to you is the withdrawal of the UK and EU rules. Now this is a Europa document. It's been updated multiple times. So this is where people are probably aware that UK notified bodies won't be allowed to certify CE products at the end of December. So this is where this documentation came from Europa. It's been updated multiple times, and the last update was on the 13th of March. And in the 13th of March, they actually said, addition, that where a product is certified by a notified body based in Northern Ireland, the indication of UK Northern Ireland must be indicated with the CE mark. So it's a very specific need, but there is a possibility that a UK Northern Ireland mark may be required, and the European Union have acknowledged that. From a test house impact, I'll just cover that very quickly. Most people are accredited by UKAS, and the test results remain valid pre and post Brexit, regardless of the trade agreement outcome. And it's basically because UKSAR are IELEC members, and from that perspective, nothing changes. Where things do change, as we've already noted, is for notified bodies. UKAS won't be able to accredit a European notified body. So there is this possibility that we are still heading for separate certification for UKCA and CE marking, and that would be an EU type examination or conformity assessment certification. So as an example, I've just put some example certificates up that may be formatted in this sort of way. So the existing EU type examination certificate for the Radio Equipment Directive template there is shown for one of our notified bodies, and then on the right hand side there is this UK Conformity Assessed certificate. Just as a point of note, whatever happens, TÜV should have covered every eventuality with our multiple notified bodies that are scattered around the world, basically. And just going on to possible outcomes. So with possible outcomes for placing products on the EU market, pre and post transition period, there's no change. So for people, if you're a UK manufacturer, if you're outside UK, it's still the same requirements. The CE marking and the wheel marks, because the actual wheel mark is required for the Marine Equipment Directive, is still required during and after the transition period for placing a product on the EU 27 market. And also UK manufacturers will still require CE wheel marking for exporting to the EU with compliance to the European directives as they are now. The big issue is the possible outcomes for Europe, for the UK, placing products on the market in the UK. Placing these in order of the highest impact first, this is incredibly unlikely, but it is still possible. There is the possibility that we do fall off a cliff and CE marking ceases to apply for manufacturers placing goods on the UK market immediately. From our perspective, that would be a ridiculous thing for the UK government to allow to happen, and everybody would want that not to happen. What's more likely is during the original no deal Brexit guidance that was put out, there was this time-limited period discussed. So that UKCA marking is required after a time-limited period. Now, generally speaking, for harmonised standards, for example, time-limited periods are normally transition periods of 18 months, 24 months. So in all likelihood, it would be 2 years. Again, nothing is set in stone currently with this, unfortunately. Also more likely, because this is based on what was stated in the original requirements, is UKCA marking will be only required when a UK approved body is required. So this is for products that do require a notified body. So this is obviously directive dependent. So for marine equipment, you have to use a notified body. So that would mean UKCA marking is required. And for UKCA marking required for products requiring the use of an approved body. So C marking would be acceptable for self-declaration. And so for something like the RED, that's dependent on harmonised standards that are available for Article 3.2 and 3.3. And then finally, there is still this possibility that we move towards a no change scenario. So we do have complete mutual recognition agreement in place, allowing full acceptance of directives and certification in both directions. So we fully accept in the UK CE marking, and they fully accept all our certification and etc. going in the other direction. That's definitely possible. And just to be clear, possible outcomes will be Directive UK Statutory Instrument dependent. One of the things we've seen already is evidence of separation. For example, for marine, the reason I specifically mention marine is that the UK Maritime and Coast Guard Agency actually released MSN 181874 Amendment 3 in the 31st of January. This actually stated and discusses about approved bodies and mentions which UK approved bodies are listed and talks about UK approvals during the transition period. But it actually, we were actually told that subsequently that you can't use this for marine. So there is actually a document already out talking about approved bodies, but they've categorically stated that this can't be used during the transition period. And we've already seen separation from a legislation perspective for aviation, where the UK has already stated we will leave the European Aviation Safety Regulator. And also the possible EU legislation divergence after Brexit could be because of what are considered to be higher risk products. Everybody's favourite subject is about drones. There's obviously lots of particularly high risk issues with respect to drones. We have our own concerns with it in the UK, and related to aviation again, we may separate out requirements for drones. And also what are considered to be higher risk legal requirements such as cybersecurity. That's specifically a problem. And what will happen next is dependent on the ongoing trade agreement, basically. Next week, the British Measurement and Testing Association, the BMTA, has a notified bodies government engagement call. So this is where there's going to be discussions about continuing discussion, so that we can, as notified bodies, we can discuss with BEIS, the Department for Business, Energy and Industry, about how notified bodies will be interacting during this period about UKCA marking and all the other requirements. And obviously, what will happen is very much dependent on the discussions that are continuing. At the moment, we are waiting for something to come out of the UK government, and really, unfortunately, it's been delayed in all probability because of COVID-19 lockdown. Just to highlight one further link, the UK government original documentation on UKCA marking has got a comment on it that it says it's been withdrawn. That doesn't mean UKCA marking's been withdrawn. This guidance has been withdrawn. So we're waiting for an update from the UK government, basically to see how they expect UKCA marking to be implemented. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Some interesting stuff there, John. So our next presenter will be Rob. So Rob, if you're ready to go.
Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. Hopefully you can all see and hear me. So yeah, interesting discussions as we've just had so far, and probably, yeah, doesn't leave much clear as a path forwards, unfortunately. I know, as we said at the beginning of the meeting, there's quite a lot of information on the internet from service providers stating that we have a very clear path forwards, which unfortunately just isn't true at the moment. And that leads us into really considering what is next. What other markets do we have available outside of Europe, outside of the UK, and particularly outside of North America, which is usually the countries most people, at least in the Western world, are interested in selling in. So Europe, North America is always the tag choices. And that leads us, as I said, to look into the global market access side. So what is it? What is global market access? Well, typically among the industry, it's known as type approval or homologation and certification. There's lots of different names for it. Global market access, or GMA, is really just a cover-all blanket comment that we give it. And the specific requirements really do depend on each country's regulatory environment. And as much as we've just seen the UK perhaps separating from the EU and removing the CE marking perhaps, actually when you look beyond Europe, most of the countries around the world have their own requirements anyway already. And as we look at the industry in general, we're seeing most electronic products are becoming battery operated. And again, many of those are adding wireless functionality too. And that wireless functionality is being added to traditionally non-wireless products. Things like lights, toothbrushes, vacuum cleaners, all of these types of products are becoming wireless now. And it's important that we recognize that that is the way the industry is moving towards. And it's almost a marketing and buzzword at the moment. And why that is important is because a traditionally non-wireless product may have one set of requirements that are quite easy to understand. But as soon as you add a wireless functionality to that device, as John's just covered, that will probably fall under the Radio Equipment Directive, and actually opens up an entirely different set of requirements that you've probably never considered. And surprisingly, the radio or the wireless requirements are actually stricter in some countries than the safety standards. So actually putting a product on the market and claiming it is safe is relatively easy in some markets. Adding a wireless product, however, can be quite difficult. And as I say, most of these countries around the world have strict government regulations that are designed to either prevent the equipment from interfering with other devices, and typically the other devices, maybe other consumer products, but most likely it's things like the military and the radar equipment, particularly the 5 gig wireless LAN and so on, can interfere with military equipment quite a lot. And likewise, potentially causing health problems. As I say, we're all familiar with the mobile phone batteries exploding, again, mobile phone chargers catching on fire and things like this. So that is generally what the two the schemes are set out to. And in most countries, the compliance is mandatory, and there are strict penalties if you don't adhere to the rules, which I'll cover at the end. Europe has been somewhat lax, perhaps, in enforcing those requirements for products that don't comply, and many of us will see, there's flooding the market of cheap, inferior products coming from countries around the world. I just cover this slide really quickly because actually when you look around the world, there's many different ways of getting a product onto the market. As we've just covered for CE marking and the UK CA mark, particularly there's one of two routes really. It's either self-declaration or a notified body. One of those two things really will get most of your products onto the market, give or take. But actually around the world, some of the countries have very similar schemes where you can self-declare. Some of them are, I guess, their version of notified bodies. But actually, in a lot of countries, you have to deal with the regulator or the government directly to get that approval. Or in fact, you have to work with a lab, such as TÜV, who have agreements with the government to help you get your product on their market. So it's very important to just recognise that actually there's a lot of different schemes beyond what you might be used to for Europe and perhaps the UK CA mark, should it happen. So if we just start at the beginning, then what is it you need to think about when you're selling your product around the world, or perhaps considering to take your product beyond those markets where you've currently sold? So essentially, what is your product? Is it a battery operated product? Is it mains powered? What technologies does it have? As we mentioned, lots of products these days are becoming wireless enabled, adding things like wireless LAN, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth or something else into it. And where are you going to sell it essentially? So is it just Europe? Is it a product that you've intended just to sell locally? Or actually, is there potential for this to be sold around the world? With the advent of the internet, of course, it's pretty easy nowadays to reach a much wider target audience than perhaps you ever could have in the past. Also consider how may it or how will it change in the future? Is this just a prototype that you're looking to sell to a few countries, particularly with the likes of Kickstarter? We've seen but you can sell your products quite easily around the world, or at least attract a different target audience. But is that the product that you intend to sell permanently? And likewise, what testing can or should you do now to enable the best possible market options in the future? So where to start, essentially? Well, if we start and we see the confusion that's happening just from the UK CA mark and all the comments that you've just heard from John and Di earlier on, the UK CA is just the start, actually. And many countries around the world, they're introducing their own schemes. Perhaps they're not making the requirements clear. Actually, most of us used to these days, we have a question, we go online and we expect to find the answer to 99% of life's problems on the internet nowadays. Actually, when it comes to some of the countries and the requirements for selling your product around the world, it's really not very clear. And as I say, the awareness there, many countries don't actually make it obvious that something, and whatever that something is required. And more often than not, manufacturers find out when it's too late. So, when your product has got to the customs in their country, you've shipped in a big quantity of them, and actually that's when you find out that you don't have the magic piece of paper or the right label or rubber stamp on your product to get in. And actually, what we're seeing as well is many countries are introducing, I've put it here, the same but different, similar to what we may do with the UKCA, where we adopt it partially. Countries are introducing schemes, existing schemes that we have in Europe or perhaps the FCC, but with a different twist. A perfect example of this is the ROSH requirements of a restriction of hazardous substances. This is actually growing in popularity around the world. Over the last 12 to 18 months, we've seen quite a few countries adopt their own ROSH requirements. And most of these are based on the EU requirements, which are actually pretty comprehensive. But these countries are introducing them and implementing them in their own way. And secondly, where is it that you're looking to sell? So where are you selling at the moment? As I say, is it Europe? Is it the US? Is it Canada? And of course the UK. And I mention that to start off with to set the scene, because the US and Canada, they have what's known as certification options, particularly for wireless products. And it is technology dependent, of course. There's declaration of conformity route, similar perhaps to Europe, but the certification route, as I mentioned, for wireless products is the one that's actually slightly different. What you have to do here is test your product in a lab and get it approved by a TCB. So we've just heard earlier on about notified bodies. Similar to a notified body perhaps is a TCB, so a telecommunications certification body. Again, tough sud is these around the world. But essentially for the FCC, for Europe and Canada, the key takeaways would be perhaps an FCC report and an FCC grant, or an Industry Canada, an IEC report, and IEC grant. And why I mention those will be clear in a moment. But likewise, if you're selling into Europe, there's a range of directives that you have to comply with, be it the Radio Equipment Directive, the EMC Directive, and so on. And more often than not, these are self-certification. So you make a declaration of conformity or a DOC, and that's oftentimes enough for you to sell your product in Europe. But again, as we've just heard, perhaps you need to approach a notified body to help with certain products where we don't have harmonized standards for them. And essentially the takeaway, and I'm including the UK in this for now, although the UK CA Mark may come in, as we've heard, let's just include the UK within Europe for now, because ultimately you're probably still going to have test reports to EN standards, because likely the UK CA will recognise the same standards. So why is that important? Well, the deliverables, what you're going to have, depending on where you sell, whether it's Europe, whether it's the UK, whether it's North America, you're going to have a set of test reports, probably for radio, EMC, electrical safety, some performance, and so on and so on. Maybe you've got a certification number, whether that's from the FCC, is it in the form of an FCC ID, or maybe that's from a notified body using their number. And you've probably got a declaration of conformity. Whether you're selling to North America, Europe, or the UK, you're going to have a declaration of conformity that you've created that lists out how your product complies with those requirements. And again, the key takeaway phrases just from those two different routes would be the reports. So is that an FCC report and a grant, or is it a CE report and a DOC? And I'll just jump in here as well to mention the CB scheme. Actually, the CB scheme covers electrical safety. It's an international system of mutual acceptance of test reports around the world. There's over 50 member countries of the IEC CB scheme at the moment. But actually, it's accepted by many, many more around the world. So although there's 50 member countries, there's probably another 100 on top that will actually look at or recognise those CB scheme reports. Now, no matter what happens, whether we have UK CA marking or not, the UK will still remain a member body of this scheme. And actually, the UK already has deviations for plugs and sockets, the BS1363 and different amp requirements. We have 13 amps in the UK versus 16 in other countries, and so on. So actually, it doesn't matter what happens with the UK CA marking. We're still going to be a member of the CB scheme. And as I say, we already have national deviations anywhere. Actually, on the CB scheme, they've already got a statement on their website covering this, and this state, as I've put there, a CB test certificate and its related test report can be utilised by a manufacturer as part of their technical file for the UK CA marking. Of course, we don't actually know what UK CA marking is going to be, but they've made it very clear on their website, that as things stand at the moment, it should be accepted. So as I put there, Brexit and the UKCA should really have no impact on the testing required for the CB scheme. We just cover marking really quickly, actually, because one of the comments that we hear quite a lot so far when our customers have asked us about the UK CA mark is, we don't have space on our label, or we don't have space on our product for another label or marking. But actually, when you look at it around the world, many countries have their own marks already. Many manufacturers have managed to put these labels on their products. And one of the comments always that we hear is, well, my mobile phone doesn't have all these markings printed on it. And whilst that's true, actually buried within the software, you will probably find that those are labelled on the product electronically, or actually if you go to the country where that product is sold, you may well find different markings printed on the product versus what you see on your product if you've bought it in the UK or Europe or the US. And many manufacturers have different SKUs or versions of the product, actually depending on the country where it's sold. But it is important that we recognise that actually, the UKCA may mean additional labelling to be put on the product or the packaging. But actually, around the world, there's lots of different labels that may apply anywhere. So if you are thinking of selling your product elsewhere, it's actually really important that you consider this early on. Because for some countries, that label's not actually issued until the very end of the process, until the certificate's complete. So for Europe, and of course for UKCA, if it's applicable, we know what that artwork is already, and you can prepare your product with that label in advance. Actually, for some countries, there's perhaps a certificate number or a code or an ID that will be placed on a product. And as I say, that's not known until the very end of the process. So if you have manufacturing that needs to print those labels on the product, it's very important that you consider those requirements up front so you can make sure the tooling and so on is prepared in advance, ready to print on the product. Now, when it comes to selling products around the world, there's essentially two different approaches here. So there's type approval with testing or documentation-only applications. Obviously, for every country, whether it's Europe or whatever, there's probably going to be some form of testing that has to be done. And I mentioned here, so the type approval with testing for wireless and EMC and so on is very similar to the FCC process. So, you may have tested for the FCC, it has to be done in an authorized lab. And if you want to sell your products perhaps in China or elsewhere, you might have to do additional testing in that country's lab. So you've gone through all the pain of getting your product compliant for CE and perhaps for UKCA. And now you decide you want to sell your product to China or perhaps Brazil or one of the many other countries around the world. And essentially you have to repeat all of that work anywhere. And it may well be that there's full product testing required, or at least just a functional evaluation. So in several countries actually, and perhaps some of the more developing countries, they will ask for samples of products that are non-returnable. It's questionable perhaps what testing they're really going to do on it, especially if it's quite a nice shiny new device and they want a half dozen free samples sending to them. But it's at least something to be aware of. And of course, there's still a requirement for technical documents and a submission of some sort of paperwork to that authority. And as I mentioned, you'll get a certificate once all that's issued. Now, regardless of what happens with Brexit and the UKCA, this approach should not be affected. For some of the countries, they actually copy-paste, for want of a better term, what happens within Europe and the EN standards. And of course, that's all what the UK is perhaps going to do, is just copy and paste existing standards. But the approach perhaps that is going to be more affected is that one which uses your existing European or CE test reports. So you've gone through your testing already, you have some reports, you're selling your product in Europe and you're deciding to branch out and sell it further afield. This is good because you've got the test reports already. It should be pretty simple. There's no test samples required, just a collection of technical documents that you've probably already got. But then you have to submit these in many cases to that regulatory authority. So although Europe, if you don't have to have a notified body opinion, you create a declaration of conformity, you self-certify against your product, and you can sell it essentially without telling anybody that you're selling it. But that's not the case in many countries. You have to apply for permission to be able to sell your product. And there's a certificate that's actually issued. So rather than self-declaring, you probably have a certificate that's issued to you to be able to sell. Now, the paperwork approach is not always easier or faster, especially in some of the developing countries. Actually, they can take quite a long time to issue that certificate to be able to sell your product. And there may be additional factory inspections or import and shipment inspections that are required. So again, it's quite different to the approach we have in Europe, where we can essentially just sell our products, put them on the market and sell them. In many of these countries, they're much more strict and formal in checking the product and verifying that what you're selling is legit and does meet the requirements. Now, when you go for the documentation only approach, actually many times you need to use your EU DOC to support what you're submitting. And of course, at this time, it's unknown whether these countries are going to accept any form of additional UKSAR DOCs that may be created or anything like this. But probably, if you're selling into Europe, you're going to have an EU DOC anyway, so it shouldn't be a problem. Now, another consideration is, what about those UK overseas territories? So, of course, we have several countries still under sovereign control, UK overseas territories. Anguilla, for example, they accept FCC reports. They don't have any consideration for CE or EN reports as it stands. And there's an additional application that you have to make anyway. So if you want to sell your product into Anguilla, as an example, you have to have an FCC grant and a report to be able to sell it. So even though it's a UK overseas territory, they have no consideration for what we do in the UK. So of course that shouldn't be affected by any change to CE or UKSAR or Brexit. Likewise, Bermuda, they accept FCC reports or EU reports with an additional application again. So of course, if you're submitting your FCC reports, there should be no change. If you're submitting your European reports, then you currently need to have an EU DOC as well. And of course, it's unknown whether they'll accept any form of UKSAR DOCs should they exist. And again, just moving on, the Virgin Islands, they accept both FCC or European reports, and they would still require separate approvals there. And again, it's unknown whether anything additional for the UK would be accepted in the Virgin Islands just yet. Likewise, the Falkland Islands actually accept the CE marking. So even though these countries may be not too far apart from each other geographically, actually their requirements are very different. So the Falkland Islands accept CE marking as it is as an overseas country territory, and we're expecting then that they will adopt whatever applies with the UKSAR. But we don't know, of course, whether the Falkland Islands will have some additional agreement that they accept for CE marking, or whether they should accept the UKSAR marking. So actually, it's quite interesting that some of these countries are perhaps affected beyond what we would anticipate by just the UK and just Brexit happening. And then just finally, we look at, for example, Gibraltar. We would perhaps, all assume that is just part of the UK and, a UK there. But actually, they will accept a declaration of conformity granted by the UK or any other EU country already to sell there. And of course, they've never been part of the EU customs union, so their requirements are likely to align to the UK. But again, will they accept CE marking given that they're joined by land, or will they just accept UKSAR marking? A consideration, so just to bear in mind if you are selling into these countries now or in the future. So yeah, just to sort of round up some of the questions that we've had, and I know John covered some of these But you tested in a UK-based lab. Help. You want to sell your product somewhere else around the world. That lab or that country perhaps requests European reports from an accredited lab. Well, as John covered, we are, especially in the UK, where UKAS accredited, and UKAS is a member of ILAC, so those test reports would still be accepted, no problem. Your existing EMC or RF testing shouldn't be impacted by a deal or no deal Brexit. And actually, on the next slide, I'll just cover some of those MRAs that are in place as well. Countries that require a European DOC with the approval application, will they accept the UK CA DOC? And of course, that's unknown at present. It's likely they will still need to have a European DOC because those requirements are based on EN standards, and at least in the short term. But perhaps the UKSAR marking may be adopted in the future. And as John just mentioned, what is impacted there, especially if the UKSAR mark does become a requirement and a reality. So I just touched on it there. The UK has already signed a number of MRAs related to conformity assessment with the US. Essentially, this replicates the effect of the European-US MRA, and it would apply to the UK-US relationship. This essentially means that we can still test in the UK towards FCC standards to sell your product over there. Likewise with Japan, there's a signed letter that exists today. There's not an actual MRA yet, but there's a signed letter that's been put in place to ensure continuity of the Europe-Japan MRA, irrespective of what happens. Again, it just means that there's mutual acceptance of our reports and testing, so we can continue to test to Japanese standards within the UK, and of course, Japan can continue to test to whatever may happen. Likewise, Australia and New Zealand, they've put measures in place to facilitate market access between the two countries. And Israel, they've put a trade agreement covering the conformity of industrial products. So there's lots of mutual recognition agreements that are existing today already before we have UKSAR marking, should it apply. And I'm sure there'll be many more to come. Of course, it's always worth just bearing in mind that there are risks of selling products without approvals. So as I've mentioned, many countries around the world actually have their own requirements in addition to what you may already be doing for Europe. So yeah, if the UK goes a separate route and has their own scheme, actually it's probably not going to be too far different from what exists in many countries already. And it's just mentioned, it's worth bearing in mind that products may be banned from a marketplace. You may have huge fines imposed, no sales, negative publicity, and so on. So actually, if you're looking to sell your products beyond Europe, it's always worth reaching out to a test house or your provider, such as TÜV, to make sure that your products are compliant in the countries you're selling them. And in just summary then, Brexit and whatever happens at the beginning of next year, it shouldn't cause any issues with selling your products globally or in any other countries. Again, whatever happens, UKSAR should be no more effort than some of the other countries anyway. So if you're already selling your product beyond Europe, actually UK is probably going to be no different than any of those countries anyway. Your existing EN test reports can still be used outside the EU in most countries that accept them. And finally, of course, there's still lots of opportunities to expand the markets you sell in beyond Europe and the UK. And that's it. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you very much, Rob. So that comes to the end of our presentations. I would like to thank all the attendees and all of our hosts for today.